When is rioting rational? Now, first of all, I want to say that this is not an endorsement of it. I'm not encouraging it. I'm not even condoning it. I just want to look at the incentives that lead to it and the conditions that lead to it. And it's clear that there are very different incentives for different kinds of people. So, for example, if you are part of the privileged non-white victim class, then there are very different incentives than if you're part of the oppressed white oppressor class. And so if you're one of these privileged non-white victims, there aren't going to be many immediate consequences for rioting. There aren't. As long as there's a few dozen of you, you'll be allowed to do it. You'll get away with it. Authorities, cops will take a very hands-off approach. The media will kiss your ass. Celebrities will kiss your ass. Corporations will kiss your ass. You'll be allowed to do it. There will be no immediate consequences. You can riot to your heart's content. You can destroy whatever you want, which I imagine could be quite cathartic. You can loot. You can keep what you loot. You won't be arrested, most likely. If you are arrested, you won't be charged. And if you are charged, the charges will be dropped. So, the incentives here seem pretty clear cut. Now, there are long-term consequences to rioting. You will destroy your community. You will destroy businesses in your community. There will be fewer businesses and fewer opportunities for you in the future, both to work and to buy products. A lot of the larger businesses won't move into your community. You'll probably have to buy from mom and pop businesses that have higher prices, and they're probably racist, and they have guns, and they'll protect their stores because they can't get insurance. So there are long-term costs. There are long-term consequences to rioting. But if we know anything about these type of people, we know that that doesn't matter to them because they can't think long-term anyway. So in the present, in the short term, there are almost no consequences. There are almost no downsides to rioting. It's all upside. And so why wouldn't they with those kind of incentives? Now, it seems like the cops and the authorities and the government and everyone else, they're taking kind of a hands-off approach to this. They're taking kind of a soft approach, a kid glove approach to this kind of rioting because they don't want to lose legitimacy with that community. I want to know what kind of legitimacy these people think they have with that community. I mean, these people think that they're being hunted down and murdered for sport. And, that's probably partially a narrative of their own creation, but it's also a narrative that's being force-fed to them through the media and being crafted by academia and distributed through the entertainment and news media. And that has in a large part incited and led to these riots. So I don't know what kind of legitimacy the cops and the authorities have to lose by cracking down on this. These people think they're literally being hunted down and murdered by cops for sport. So I don't know what kind of legitimacy they think they would lose by cracking down on it. It's almost like this whole situation is engineered to be an irresolvable conflict that can never be talked down, never negotiated away, that can only end in violence and conflict. But that's probably a subject for another video. This video is about rioting and the incentives for rioting. And it looks like the incentives for rioting are pretty clear-cut and pretty positive for certain groups of people. Now, and it's also big business. You have this whole Black Lives Matter movement, which is based on this false fake news narrative that's being pushed by the media and everybody else about cops hunting down and killing blacks for sport, which is fake. It's false. But that's what this Black Lives Matter organization is based on, this false narrative. And it has a bunch of others too, because it's a radical communist revolutionary organization with a bunch of radical revolutionary communist agendas. It's not just about that one fake narrative. But it's a big business. They've made millions of dollars off of these riots. Millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars. And if you count associated organizations and, affinity organizations, maybe billions of dollars in basically kickbacks, extortion money off of these riots. And so what we're seeing here is race hustling on a industrial scale. It's systemic race hustling, if you will. Now, we've had race hustling for a long time. Guys like Al Sharpton and Jesse Jackson and organizations like the SPLC have been doing, small-time race hustling for decades, where they will identify somebody who has committed some kind of transgression of the politically correct orthodoxy, and they'll come down on them, and they'll use their clout, their media clout, to try to ruin these people and extract confessions and apologies and monetary donations from these people. And this has been going on for decades. But this, Black Lives Matter thing has taken it to a whole nother level. It's systemic race hustling. It is a huge extortion racket where they're using the threat of riots and violence based on these false but unfalsifiable narratives. They're unfalsifiable because they're constructed in such a way with the Kafka traps and everything that if you try to argue against it, you're part of the oppression in the narrative. They're using these to conduct extortion on a mass scale. This systemic race hustling, which, unlike systemic racism, where nobody actually has to be racist for systemic racism, apparently, this systemic race hustling that I'm talking about is just race hustling on a massive scale. They're all doing it. The media is doing it. The Democratic Party's doing it. All these corporations that are supporting it are doing it. And, of course, Black Lives Matter is doing it. And the ordinary rioters and looters out on the streets, many of whom are just opportunists and have no ideological agenda, apart from maybe believing, these false fake news narratives that are fueling all this. They're participating in this giant race hustle. So that's what this is. It's a power grab and a money grab and a resource grab. And it's all enabled by false fake news narratives coming from a variety of sources at every level of society, from every major institution, and supported by complicit cops and complicit authorities who are taking a lax and hands-off approach to dealing with it, just sort of letting it run its course or whatever they're doing to avoid squandering what they think of as the legitimacy they may have with this community and others, which I don't know what legitimacy they even think they have. That's ridiculous to think they would have any legitimacy, under these circumstances. Now, moving past all that, the incentives, if you are one of the white oppressor class, the disenfranchised, dispossessed, disprivileged white oppressor class, those are very different. Now, if you try to defend yourself against these riots or, heaven forbid, engage in any of your own, you absolutely will be stopped. We saw this in London when we had a week or more of protest with monuments destroyed and many injured, including dozens of cops. It was just, mostly peaceful protests. But whenever nationalists finally showed up to defend their monuments, then the media came down on it. Then they said it was, hate groups or whatever, all their propagandistic terms of arts. And then the cops put on their riot gear and showed up in force. So that's what's happening over there. In Albuquerque, there was a group of miscreants trying to tear down a statue of a Spanish conquistador, and the cops were just standing by and letting it happen. And when there was an altercation between them and an armed citizen of some sort, which resulted in the armed citizen defending himself with a firearm, that's when the cops swooped in and arrested not only him, but every other armed citizen who was standing by as part of a counter-protest or a militia group keeping an eye on things, which apparently weren't even related to this one guy who got in the altercation and shot somebody who was attacking him with a skateboard and a knife. No relationship between those two things, but of course they swoop in, they arrest the guy with the gun, and they arrest everybody else with guns as well. leaving the anarchist Antifa and Black Lives Matter. I don't even know if they have Black Lives Matter in Albuquerque, but whatever kind of leftist detritus was out there trying to tear down this statue, leaving them apparently unmolested. Now, they did drop the charges against that guy in Albuquerque, which made me really happy, but it just shows that there's a different standard that's being applied here to the oppressed white oppressor class versus the privileged non-white victim class. Or, anybody kind of opportunistically glomming onto their narrative, like Antifa, most of whom are white and, way more privileged than normal, even for whites. So, very different standards here. Absolutely, if you are part of the white oppressor class, oppressor class, you will be met with the full force of the law if you try anything like this or even try to defend yourself from it. But when we see these double standards, this is something that instinctively rankles, every white man, to see this kind of manifestly unjust double standard applied against us. And part of why it's so offensive is an intuitive understanding of where these kinds of double standards lead. So, these double standards have only gotten worse. They've been around for a long time. They've been around for decades, at least since the 60s, where certain groups of people have been treated with special protections and special privileges, and all the responsibilities and all the obligations and all the duties and all the costs and all the consequences fall on us. And that's been going on for a long time, but what has changed over time is the magnitude of those double standards, the difference between the standards applied to the one group and to the others. That has only changed over time, and it's become more and more oppressive and more burdensome and more offensive and more insulting over time. And, it may be starting to reach the point where people can no longer bear it. And so, yes, it's tremendously more risky and more costly for white people to riot. But it's also becoming tremendously more risky and more costly for white people not to riot because of the magnitude of these manifest injustices, these unfair double standards, these provocations of the incitement of these, supposedly oppressed, privileged victim underclasses against us, with false narratives targeted at us that vilify us. Now, we've seen this false narrative emerge over the last 7 years or so about, these racist cops systematically hunting down and exterminating blacks for sport. Totally false narrative. It's based on literally a handful of highly publicized incidents, most of which don't even fit the narrative, and ignoring hundreds of others, ignoring thousands of others, ignoring all the statistical evidence. We're just building this false fake news narrative off of a handful of instances, and it's totally false. It's actually the opposite of what is true. Proportional to the amount of crimes they commit and the amount of interactions they therefore have with police officers, blacks are less likely to be killed, are less likely to be attacked by police than whites. So it's exactly opposite this narrative, but we've seen it take off and take hold over the last 6 or 7 years. And so that should give us pause about all the narratives in our history books that demonize us and that vilify us and our ancestors. One word you've heard thrown around a lot lately is genocide. A lot of these BLM people saying that slavery and segregation was genocidal. Well, at the time of the American Revolution, there were a few 100,000 slaves in America. At the time of the Civil War, there were a few million slaves in America. Now there are 45 million descendants of slaves in America. That's a pretty shitty genocide. That narrative doesn't work at all. So yes, there were some, let's say, tremendously high mortality rates along the Middle Passage, but obviously the intent and the effect was not genocidal. There may have been some mass murder involved, but neither the effect nor the intent were genocidal in any way, shape, or form. In fact, quite the opposite. There was a tremendous proliferation and explosion of the slave population in colonial times and in early America, and then of the descendants of slave populations after the abolition of slavery. Exactly the opposite of a genocide. So that word is totally inapplicable. But there you have it. It's a blood libel. It's another false, fake narrative designed to gin up hatred against the oppressed white oppressor class and to incite violence like we've been seeing and looting like we've been seeing, directed supposedly against us, but actually taking place mostly within the communities of these people who are being incited to this. And you have others, like the whole Native American genocide thing, where it's claimed that our ancestors killed millions of Native Americans when they took over this continent. That can't be substantiated. It can't be proven that there were even more than a few million here when Columbus arrived, when Europeans started exploring North America. And, as far as the total number actually killed in violent conflicts and confrontations, the U.S. Census Bureau puts that at something between 30 and 50,000. And they killed 20,000 of us. So, there were some fights, there were some battles. It went both ways. There was raiding against our settlements as well. Wasn't a genocide as conventionally understood. Now maybe you could make some case by the UN definitions or whatever, owing to, loss of territory and loss of resources, causing, a discontinuity in cultural whatever, and decrease in population. That did happen. But now there are approximately as many Native Americans as there were when North America was discovered, at least as far as we know. So, really, that narrative is tremendously overblown. And then, the narrative about the Mexican War, where, all these millions of mestizos and Aztecs streaming in from the south are acting like they have some kind of deep historical connection to the land because part of it was taken from Mexico 150 years ago. Well, first of all, that was a barely populated backwater frontier area of Mexico at the time. There were no more than 50,000 Mexicans in all of that territory when it was taken by the U.S. There were about 6,000 in Texas, and there were 30,000 American settlers in Texas. Gringo settlers, Tennessean settlers, whatever you want to call them, empresarios they called them, in Texas versus 6,000 of the Tejanos. There were another 25,000 in New Mexico and maybe another 15,000 in California. Now all of that was not Aztec territory. There were other tribes there, and those other tribes are still there. The Hopis are still there, the Navajos are still there, some of them others maybe not, but that's how history goes. But the Mexicans who were there and the Indians who were there were incorporated into the United States. They weren't dispossessed. So that whole narrative is totally overblown. And if you look at any of these narratives, if you start picking at them and poking at them, they're totally overblown, almost to the point of being fabricated. There's usually some kind of kernel of truth in there somewhere, but the way that it's presented is basically a total fabrication. And so when we're seeing this narrative evolve in real time about these cops hunting down and killing these blacks for sport because they're racist and how it's a huge problem, even though it only happens a few times a year, and the statistics don't really show that this being the case, blah, blah, blah. You got to look at all these narratives all the way back to the beginning. They're always thrown in our face. that are always used to slander us, to defame us, to demoralize us, to denigrate us, to blood libel our ancestors, and to deny the legitimacy of our interests and our existence. And you've got to question all of it, because they're almost all just as fake. Almost all just as fake. And we see where it leads. We see the violence it leads to, and the destruction it leads to, and the danger that we're in. Personally, our families, our property, our businesses, our country, our civilization, we see the danger that we're in at the hands of these, malicious Marxist propagandists who are putting out all this crap, this false crap, these fake news narratives to incite this violence, to instigate this violence, to rile up these outgroups against us. And when you see where all this is leading, yes, even though any attempt to resist or revolt on our part would be met by an attempt to suppress us, more and more the costs of not doing that are getting to be far worse. And so in the very near future, if not already, the incentives are going to point towards riot and revolt and revolution for whites as well. Not just for the privileged non-white victim class, but for the oppressed white oppressor class as well. And that's where we're going if something doesn't change course like immediately or yesterday. And it doesn't look like it's changing course.